Let me do that again.
Okay, go
All
ahead.
right.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Frederick Nybig. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. We have an exciting topic today and one that's critically important to MedTech startups in not just in this part of the world, but globally. We have two outstanding speakers that will introduce themselves in just a moment. Today's topic, this is our webinar number 5 in our series, is regulatory strategy, where we will be examining and contrasting regulatory pathways and strategies in Asia Pacific and in the US. With me from the MedTech Innovator team, I have Bernice Tan here, who heads our events and marketing, Glenn Lim, who is a senior director of programs, and Narissa, who's just joined us as program manager. So for those of you who are online, our cohort companies, welcome back. I think you know the drill by now. Queue up your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or raise your hand later as we get into the Q&A part of this. Let me just just set the stage. Remind everyone here that we did a survey with all of our cohort companies about 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago or so, asking you to provide specific questions related to a number of topics, including regulatory. We had a number of questions from our participating cohort companies that are related to regulatory affairs. So many of those questions will be covered during today's discussion, as you will see. But for the cohort companies, stay on for the 30-minute Q&A at the end, and you'll be able to ask any specific questions that you have that relates either to your regulatory strategy in APAC or in the US. So with that, I'm thrilled to present to you our speakers today. We have dialing in from Los Angeles, from Veranex, Jessica Richter. Is that the correct pronunciation, Jessica?
Got it.
And she will introduce herself in just a moment. Great to have you join us. We also have Associate Professor Jack Wong, who's based here in Singapore, founder of ARPA, the Asia Regulatory Professional Association. But Jack is one of those people who wears multiple hats, and he'll talk a bit about that. So I'll have each of them introduce themselves in just a moment. So great panelists, important topic. And let me turn to Jessica first. If you could just briefly introduce yourself, tell us a bit about Veranex and your role at the company, and perhaps also tell us a bit about how your organization typically engages with MedTech startup companies.
Yeah, thanks, Frederick, and really appreciate being involved with MedTech Innovator globally for the last 6 years. This is such an important program, so congratulations to the cohort companies for being a part of this really exciting accelerator. So just a bit about Veranex. We're an end-to-end solutions partner. We provide really exclusively medical device companies with support in 3 key areas: product design and engineering, preclinical services, and then the business unit that I oversee is CRO and consulting services. And that's inclusive of regulatory, quality, clinical, commercial strategy, market access, data analytics, HEOR, things like that. We have a global team, so primarily offices in the US, in Europe, as well as in India. We do have a small subset of our team in Australia. No boots on the ground formally yet in Asia, but very much looking forward to expanding in that area. We've got about 1,100 people around the globe. And typically it's, interesting, we're a large company, but 75% of the clients that we support are early stage startups. And oftentimes the reason that is there'll be a clinician or an engineer or someone in business that is clear on the unmet need. They're building their team. They may be anywhere from, 3 to 30 people. But oftentimes there are gaps in their competencies or gaps in capabilities that are on that journey of bringing a device from inception all the way through to commercialization. So in some instances, we serve as an extension of our client's team, offering or being their regulatory team. In other instances, we may guide them along the process with a reg strategy or commercial market strategy, or representing them as their CRO, conducting usability studies or conducting preclinical studies. So, most startups can do some things, but not all things, and that's where they enlist our support.
Makes sense. And of course, thanks for that, Jessica. And of course, Veranex has been, as you just said, a partner of MedTech Innovator in the US for a number of years already. Jack, welcome back. Tell us a bit about your role and about ARPA and your background.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation again. And I have a number of roles for APA, stand for Asia Regulatory Professionals Association. As you can see, it's association for people working in the regulatory field. So we have a good member, about 7,000 members now in mainly Asia. You'll be a good network if the startup fund is helpful to associate with so that you can gain some knowledge and relationship with different regulatory professionals in the association. And our scope could be device, pharmaceutical, cosmetic, etc. And again, to startup colleague, sometimes you want to know more options about your product. You never know, maybe your medical device could be different classification. Then, good to talk to different kinds of regulatory people, maybe. So that's our association. Me also recently take up a role as a CEO of another startup as well, which is a spin-off from university. So I understand as a startup life is very fun, lots of new learning. That's why, again, with the help of a MedTech innovator, they try to bring you many different networks because you cannot just be knowing everything. You need to work with different party or expert to get things done. So to me, I really realize it now. Lastly, I also do teaching in university. If there are any participant here interested to be a guest speaker in our university, let me know. We always want to share our experience or your startup experience in university so the students understand, some more interesting career option maybe they can aware. So thank you again for invitation.
Thanks a lot, Jack, and we'll certainly provide your contact details and Jessica's at the end of the webinar to our cohort companies. So just to sort of set the context here a little bit, question we usually always ask is when, and I'll turn to Jack maybe first on this. When do you feel that a startup medtech company needs to plan their regulatory strategy and think about their regulatory strategy, because they may be 4 or 5 years away from commercialization, and at what point does it make sense for a startup to appoint an external expert to support this?
Thank you, Frederick. Of course, you may hear this a lot, particularly from regulatory person. Maybe they will say as soon as possible.
Exactly.
Even when you have the idea only, not even prototype everything. Because one simple example you can imagine, if you come up with an idea to solve some problem, you quickly want to identify what option you have. Oh, your product is a medical device or a drug or cosmetic or even food or anything. Because if you know your product is a particular category, your preparation work is different. Your clinical study different, your testing data different. So, you don't want to suddenly all the way done everything and then come back and then say the regulator tell you, oh, you want to be this product and this classification, then you realize you need to do the test again. Oh, that report is not recognized because it's not done in a proper lab. Then it's a nightmare. We need to do it again. Why not have this strategy in place early? So get your regulatory input ASAP. Super helpful, and maybe you will find a way to launch quicker as well. So that's what I will recommend. Thank you.
No, that's good, and I guess Jessica, you would only agree with what Jack has just said. So I'm assuming anything you'd like to add to that, and when do you think it makes sense for a startup to appoint an external expert?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Jack said is valid no matter what geography you're looking at. I think one of the challenges of starting on a regulatory or codifying your regulatory strategy too early is sometimes as you iterate your device, your strategy can really change. So when clients come to us, and this kind of speaks, Frederick, to your question, when do you engage a regulatory person? Early on, everything Jack said is right. You want to make sure, am I a regulated medical device? Am I a combo product? Like, where do I fall generally? That's helpful. But to really start to hone in on the specifics of your pathway and with which, depending upon US or wherever you're looking, you really want to make sure you're clear on your 4 things, and I'll repeat this: your product description. So what does your product do? Have a description of it, not just one sentence, but a robust paragraph. What's your intended use and indications for use? So whom are you using this in, what environment, who's the user, what's the patient population, what's the disease state, et cetera. And then really importantly in the US, what are your aspirational marketing claims? So what do you hope to say about your product in the marketing material, on the banners at the big conferences, when your sales reps are speaking to physicians? With those things fairly well developed, then you can really begin to put the kind of pen to the paper, if you will, and develop out what is your pathway going to be. Without those things defined, you can still say, am I a regulated medical device or not? But it will be increasingly difficult to get very clear on your pathway, at least in the US and the European market.
That's really helpful, and I like your comment about thinking about aspirational marketing claims, because that's not a piece of advice you hear all that often, but I think that's certainly a great point. Just staying with you, Jessica, for a moment. What again, before we dive into the technical details here, what are some of the common pitfalls that you see amongst early and mid-stage medical device companies, and what can companies do to mitigate some of those?
Yeah, I mean, as Jack mentioned, it's really being a founder and being in an early stage startup, you're wearing so many different hats. And so my hat's off to people running organizations like that, because there's a lot of pressure and a lot at stake. I think one of the pitfalls that I see companies do is, my product can do everything, and trying to go to market with like a basket full of all the things the product can do, instead of really focusing on what's the MVP, not most valuable product, what's the minimally viable product? What are the bare minimum things that I need to bring to market to address an unmet clinical need, to be able to really make an impact in the industry? And then maybe taking a stepwise approach to market, instead of really from the outset having a product that is so incredibly complicated that your regulatory pathway then becomes complicated. It's great to have a vision of where you're going, but sometimes taking 2 or 3 steps instead of a giant leap is a more efficient and more effective way to get to market.
That's really helpful. And Jack, what are some of your examples of pitfalls that you've seen among startups, and things that they can do to avoid them?
Thank you, Frederick. And I also fully agree with Jessica that the minimum viable, because a few things, when I talk to a lot of founder or researcher, they are more thinking perfection, they seldomly think about launch time. They more think about more thing to do, more thing to improve, more study maybe. And when they talk about launch time, they maybe copy somebody friend's slide. Okay, normally how many months in US, how many months in Europe or Asia? Then they say, yeah, typically medical device, that's a perfect. I just copy that slide. So to me, they feel like regulatory is just a slide, and then tell the investor, and then they will be okay, because everybody using that maybe slide already. But to us, regulatory is quite creative. Just the team mentioned, how about classification? If a different classification, already very different timeline, why you need to follow your so-called competitor or other company? Another thing is, if you have this mindset, according to pitfall is the creative mindset, that you always think your product is this product, then you lost a lot of options. Like I just mentioned, your product could be classified differently, and also could be lower risk classification. Why not? Why A, B, C, D, you are D? Why not C or B or A? Like that. So there are many ways to make product launch quicker. So don't just pick somebody regulatory timeline and make it yours. Why not make a quicker one with a viable product and launch first, and then you can launch a more sophisticated product at a higher risk next phase, etc. That needs some strategy. But the thing is, the people is they try to copy some template, will be something I will highly not recommend them to do. Thank you.
That's really helpful, Jack. And maybe on that note related to classification, maybe let's get a little bit more technical here, and I'll turn to Jack maybe first on this. In terms of device classification, I think many of the startups on the call are familiar, relatively familiar with device classification. But what are some of the key differences between Asian markets, EU, and the US in terms of classification? Because not every product falls into the same classification in every jurisdiction, right?
Yes.
Jack.
Thank you. The interesting thing is in US, the classification width is so-called 3 level, 1, 2, 3. In Europe, to me, it's like 4 level, 1, 2A, 2B, 3. So sometimes, you know, the tricky part will be the middle part, you know, in Europe a little higher, then in US high or low, etc. To me, there's a few tips the team may aware. Most of the Asian country, they look based on the so-called reference country to determine their classification. So, for example, Hong Kong, Malaysia, etc., their classification normally 4 level. Then they may they normally use the US Europe classification as their reference. And most of the time, I would say 90% is okay. It won't be too surprising. However, a few things will make things change a lot. That confuse startup colleague. Number one is we call it local historical reason, because some product or some medical device for some reason have some very bad adverse event happening in the countries. And then the regulator there, for historical reason or local reason, they upgrade the classification into different level because they want to have a better control of some category of product. Because in my country, we have a lot of adverse event, so we want to avoid that. So that sometimes confuse people. Oh, why this country higher or lower? Some country even not allow you to register that product, even banned. So that sometimes happen. And then some is the so-called creativity. You know, for the same alcohol wipes, for example, I think everybody know alcohol wipes, right? The tissue paper used during the COVID time. If you describe it differently, it's a different classification already. Like, oh, you use it for cleaning the wound, that could be drug. Use it to clean surgical instrument, is a medical device. Use it to clean floor, is a household product. Then you look at that product, then why my competitor is a drug? And this guy launched in supermarket tomorrow already. So that to me is a same product. You should describe differently, also different classification as well. So I hope that clarifies some mystery or confusion in Asia.
That's really helpful, Jack. Interesting perspective there. And Jessica, let's talk about the US FDA for a moment. What just as at a high level, I think again many are familiar with this in broad terms, but key differences perhaps between the 510K, PMA, de novo pathways, and specifically as it comes to de novo, because that's typically where there's a bit of confusion. What exactly is that? What's required to be considered for the de novo pathway, and what are some of the success and failure rates on using that particular pathway?
Yeah, and thank you, Jack. I love your analogy with the alcohol wipes, because I think, Frederick, that goes back to what you had said before about claims. That's the same product, but with different claims, it totally changes the classification. So it's a great example. The scalpel is another example. If it's used, you know, in the US at least for surgical, just, you know, in a general use scalpel, it's a class, you know, 1, in some instances 2 device. If it's used for ophthalmic indications, that changes the risk profile and actually makes it higher risk. So eye drops are another example. If it's used to clean the eye versus used, you know, as a agent to actually, you know, for contact lens. So really
Right.
creative, different applications. But Frederick, going back to your question, as Jack perfectly alluded to, there are 3 device classifications in the US: low risk, class 1, moderate risk, class 2, and high risk, class 3. Each of those classifications correspond with a pathway to market. So if you're a low-risk device, you register and list. It's not a huge hoopla with regard to hoops that you need to jump through. You need to have general controls, a basic quality system. And these are really low-risk products. A lot of surgical instruments, tongue depressors, a lot of stuff that you see around the hospital equipment. Class 2, moderate risk, can fall under two different regulatory submission types. The standard one that everybody talks a lot about is the 510(k) pathway. In that regulatory application or submission, you need to say that your device is substantially equivalent to another product that's already on the market in the US. So you're not saying, oh, my product's 10 times better. You're saying, I have a urinary catheter. Here's another urinary catheter. Here are all the ways that my catheter is exactly like this catheter. And there are some differences, but those differences don't raise new or different questions of safety or effectiveness, because that's really what FDA is assessing when they review your submission. Now, if you're a class 2 moderate risk device, but there isn't a predicate, there's not exactly a product that's moderate risk that your product is substantially equivalent to, then there's a process called the de novo process, or a de novo application, whereupon you submit and file with FDA to create a whole new regulatory classification for your device. I'll get back to the de novo and your questions around success and failure, but just to finish it out, class 3 high-risk devices that require PMA applications. These are products where if they fail to work as intended, the result is irreparable harm, injury, or death to the patient. So these are pacemakers. These are stimulators that really have different ways of working with the system within the body. These are products that have a really high degree of risk, but the benefit outweighs the risk. In the FDA regulatory framework, there's not a requirement of absolution when it comes to no risk. FDA recognizes every product, whether we're talking about a pacemaker or a tongue depressor, has some degree of risk. But they, or you as the sponsor, we as your advocate, need to demonstrate that the benefits outweigh the risk and that the product is safe and effective for its intended use. So Frederick, going back to your question as far as historically, the approval rate for 510(k), class 2 moderate risk devices where there's a substantially equivalent predicate device, and ideally your predicate's within the last 10 years, so you don't find a predicate from 1980. You look for a predicate ideally that's been cleared by FDA within the last 10 years. Typically the clearance rate, it's not called approval when it's a moderate risk device, is about 85%. It can fluctuate based upon the volume and the complexity of the submission, but that's typically what we see. And for submissions that don't receive FDA clearance, oftentimes it's because of deficiencies that FDA identify in that review process, and they're very transparent. They'll communicate what those deficiencies are so that if you don't get that clearance, you can complete the testing, follow up, and refile once you have everything that you need in place. De novos, in contrast, are a little more complicated because there isn't a predicate. There's no precedent. So FDA doesn't know about safety and effectiveness. The burden is on you as the sponsor to demonstrate that. So even though it's not a high-risk device, there are risks because it's not already in the market with a competitor. So for those products, the approval rating, and it's actually de novo granting, is a little bit lower than 510(k). Typically, we see a granting of anywhere between 70 to 75%. Oftentimes, de novos will not get granted if there's insufficient evidence around safety and effectiveness, or if there's issues with the proposed classification. If FDA sort of disagrees, or again, they may need more data, or if the product doesn't meet its clinical endpoint. And then finally, on the PMA side, because these are high-risk devices, approval ratings for PMA applications are typically lower. So you see around 60 to 70% of PMAs get approved. The process is much longer than that of a de novo and significantly longer than that of a 510(k). And typically for PMA submissions, they fail due to basically the stringent requirements around clinical evidence. If products don't meet their endpoints in a study, oftentimes sponsors won't even file the PMA because they know that the product doesn't work as intended. But if it's an iterative process, it's a much longer process with FDA, but it creates a lot of strategic, I would say, advantage because you and anyone else that's in that space is going to take a long time to get to market.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful, Jessica. I wanted to ask you briefly about pre-submission meetings or pre-subs. I know that there are a number of our cohort companies here that have already had pre-sub meetings with the US FDA. Why are they important? What exactly are they? And what data does a company need to, or evidence does a company need to bring to that meeting, if any at all?
Yep. So I assume that many of you, if you've engaged with FDA, have started to think about or may have engaged, as Frederick said, in pre-sub. So for those that are less familiar, pre-submission meetings are part of a Q-sub umbrella. And basically, FDA has provided device developers with an opportunity to engage early and in an ongoing dialogue with FDA before submitting your marketing application, whether it's 510K, de novo, PMA. If you have a PMA or a de novo, you should do a pre-sub. I will go that far as to say you absolutely should do at least one. For a 510K, there may be advantages to doing a pre-sub and de-risking your technology, but essentially a pre-sub's a chance to get in front of your regulator, FDA, your lead reviewer, and have a discussion around some of the areas in which there may not be as much clarity around the submission. There are other kinds of Q-sub meetings. The pre-submission is the most common, but they also have opportunities for study risk determination meetings, submission issue request meetings, informational meetings. So there's different types of meetings, but generally for pre-subs, what you want to focus on is the areas in your regulatory pathway that may not be certain. So remember, FDA is not a consultant, so you don't want to come to them and say, how am I regulated? What's my this? Is this okay? You want to come to them with a very clear plan. This is our company. This is our vision. This is our product description, intended use, indications for use. This is what we've done from a data perspective. You don't need to, and it wouldn't be my recommendation to come to FDA for every little thing. There's a lot of guidance documents, and I'll put some links in the chat to these documents, where FDA has shared their current thinking on the regulations. There's a lot of information in the public domain. If you can take a look at 510K summaries, de novo summaries, and PMA summaries. So your pre-sub should ideally be focused on the handful of areas that you might have questions about. So for example, confirmation on your regulatory strategy, confirmation on your clinical protocol or your clinical synopsis before you engage in a huge clinical study. As Jack said, you don't want to have to go back and redo testing. It's a great chance to say, hey, FDA, this is what we're thinking for our study. Here are the endpoints. It doesn't have to be a full-blown protocol. It could be a synopsis. Do you agree with this approach? Other common things we come to FDA with may be around usability and human factors testing. Again, synopsis around what those protocols would look like. Sometimes questions around cybersecurity or biocompatibility. Sometimes around sterilization, depending upon, again, your device. So, especially if it's software only, there's less precedent around software. I mean, more so now, but if we're wanting to get really clear. So pre-subs give you the chance to connect with FDA, get early guidance, mitigate some of that risk, help yourself to kind of navigate that regulatory strategy earlier on, and ideally reduce the timeline for when you finally do submit to get to clearance, granting, or approval.
Perfect. Makes sense. And Jack, is there a similar way in Asia Pacific with Asian regulators to get early feedback directly from the regulator before a company makes a final submission, or does it vary by country? What does APAC look like here?
Thank you, Patrick. And this is also a very common arrangement in Asia as well. Regulator love to talk to company before they submit very funny dossier that they don't understand. So they prefer, you talk to them so that you submit the right document, right rationale, etc. So they love to talk to company, particularly startup. They want to help them successful. There are many benefits to do it. Like Jessica just mentioned, I won't repeat, but sometime in Asia, you have a chance to ask for quicker approval because your product may be very innovative, or your product are have ability to address some very specific local population problem that unique maybe to their country or to Asia, etc. Then they will find a way to help you get approval quicker. No matter you call it green channel in China or a particular zone in Indonesia, etc. So they will suggest you, wow, your product like this, wow, we will see how to help accordingly. So a quicker approval process will be available. Sometimes you want to solve some problem or clarification. But to me, this one, I really want to echo what Jessica just mentioned is, you really don't go to the regulator and ask open questions. That could be dangerous. You should come with a clear, like Jessica mentioned, reason justification. This is a study. That's how I do it, and I believe this is enough. Because we do all these things. What do you think? So you want regulator to say yes. Well, then, oh yeah, according to the guideline, you should do everything. Then, you come home, you still don't know what to do. So you want to go there and convince rather than open questions, including classification. If you think your product is class A, go there, justify, and let them agree. Rather than, what do you think? Like we just mentioned before, right? If you describe your product differently, classification will be different. So, it's actually up to you rather than up to the regulator. So this talk is very helpful, but could be dangerous if you don't prepare. If you go there, then your classification go out for, you don't know why, because you suddenly talk one more word, then we go, oh, if you do this, okay, your product drop now. Then that will surprise you maybe. So I highly recommend to do it, but be prepared.
Very, very good. Thanks for that, Jack. And so you spoke about the green channel in China and fast tracking approvals, and related to that, I wanted to check with you, Jack, if for a company that's based in Asia Pacific, can they accelerate approval in certain markets if they have, let's say, a US FDA approval first, or a TGA approval in Australia, or an HSA approval in Singapore? Is that going to help them accelerate, let's say, NMPA approval in China, or PMDA approval in Japan? What are some of those interactions that you see between agencies? Which ones are you refer to some of the reference agencies that some APAC regulators are looking at? What are some of the strategies that a startup can follow to accelerate approval in APAC?
Thank you. There's a two way I want the team to aware. One is a typical way. I think most of the startup also aware is if you got the approval in reference country like the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, like this, you consider your product is being reviewed by a very stringent regulatory system. That, of course, gives the regulator in Asia confidence, including China. Wow, okay, good. Somebody look at your file and get approval. So you will enjoy some sort of a shorter approval time pathway and less documentation because somebody review all your maybe raw data, etc. So that's the typical way. And that's why a lot of people go to US first, maybe, for example, then come back Asia. That's one way. But today I also want to make alert to the startup here. There's also another interesting pathway that in Asia, the team may want to aware. For example, you want to go China. And China, there's a place called Greater Bay Area. The Greater Bay Area is China policy. You want to develop that zone so that you facilitate the trade, the travel, the living there, working there, etc. So what happens is, if your product already used in Hong Kong hospital, and your product considered innovative, etc., you can apply for a simple procedure and being used in Greater Bay Area. And you think about it, that's like mutual like reference country, like, oh, China recognized Hong Kong, and then Greater Bay Area, like quite a huge zone, south part of China, can use it. To start up, you will celebrate because you start launching China already without, all these many months of clinical trial or all these things. It just take few months only for that Greater Bay Area approval procedure. So there are quite an innovative way that there be some local policy. And then another one is Indonesia. There's a particular zone. They want to facilitate medical tourism. You can launch your product there without register, assuming if the doctor there want to use your product, etc. Quite similar to Highland project in China as well. So again, there are many interesting pathway as well, rather than just a typical one. There's a golden pathway, always do it. but don't forget there's many interesting way. Sorry, I want to add one more. And there are some markets are non-regulated, i.e. the medical device regulation haven't come yet.
Right.
That means you can launch tomorrow, right? And that is Hong Kong. No, I hope maybe after today call, people will start thinking launch tomorrow in Asia maybe. By the way, we also our social make a white paper on the Greater Bay Area. So feel free to contact MedTech innovator, Frederick, etc. So we can share the paper with you accordingly. So that's some of the share. Thank you.
That would be really helpful. Thanks for that, Jack. And maybe that paper, if you can share it with us, we will share it with the cohort separately. I think that would be really interesting. So Jessica, on the topic of fast tracking approval, the US, of course, has breakthrough designation, and companies achieving breakthrough designation get a lot of PR and visibility, and obviously celebrate that being selected for that pathway. So what exactly is that, and what are the benefits? Would the US FDA consider non-US startups for this as well, and how does a startup even know that it's eligible?
Great question. And Jack, I just learned a lot, so thank you. It's always fun to be on these with experts in different geographies, because I come away, I would love to see that white paper as well. So at FDA, there are some various programs. Breakthrough is one. There's also the STEP program, the Safer Technologies program. I'll focus on Breakthrough because that really has had the most impact, I think, from the investor community. It's a huge nod to investors. So for those that are unfamiliar, Breakthrough Device Designation is a program that FDA, it's not a pathway. It's a fairly new program that FDA has designed to expedite the development and review of medical devices that provide for more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversible debilitating diseases or conditions. So some of the advantages of breakthroughs, and I'll put a link into the chat, FDA has a guidance document about it, but you get priority review, you get more interactive communication with the agency. Outside of the pre-sub process, there's sprint discussions, other ways to interact. You get higher senior management engagement from FDA, and in principle, you get a more efficient review process. Absolutely, non-US companies can be considered for this breakthrough program, so it doesn't matter where in the world you come, as long as you come to FDA with the technology, again, you've got it defined. But there are some specific eligibility criteria. And so before you kind of throw your hat in the ring for breakthrough, I would encourage startups to really make sure and do an assessment as to whether they qualify. If you don't qualify for breakthrough, no big deal. There are the regulatory pathways that we've talked about. There's the Safer Technology program, which basically is like breakthrough, but doesn't have to be as high risk a device. So just to share what those eligibility criteria are, and there are 5 of them. You have to provide more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition. It has to represent a breakthrough technology, meaning there's no approved or cleared alternatives in the market. It has to offer significant advantages over the products that are currently in the market. And its availability, and ideally this is true for all devices, is in the best interest of patients. So if you did want to apply, assuming you hit all of those criteria, you would prepare what's called a breakthrough device designation request. You'd submit that with FDA. FDA would review it. You could have some interaction with them. If it's denied, it's not in the public domain. That's fine. You can continue to do what you do. If it is granted, then you get kind of to take advantage of all of those steps. What I would say, because we have successfully undergone a lot of breakthrough device applications and are in those processes with FDA, all of what the program touts and the benefits are true. We personally, with our clients, haven't seen it accelerate speed to market in the way that Jack was describing, but it does de-risk a whole lot, and there's absolutely an advantage. The other thing that is continuously a little bit unclear with Breakthrough, at one point when Breakthrough was established, there was a partnership with FDA and CMS, the Center for Medi-Cal and Medicaid Services in the US, a payer, that said if you're granted breakthrough, CMS will automatically enable payment of the product for a set period of time. Then that rule changed, and so CMS said, nope, we're not doing that. And now the rule seems to be coming back. So there may be a promise or a possibility of having some degree of reimbursement. It doesn't clarify how much. But it doesn't hurt if you do qualify for FDA's breakthrough device designation to go for it. So again, you would just want to do an eligibility assessment first, prepare that documentation, submit it to FDA, and then go ahead and ideally engage with FDA. And I'll put that link into the chat just so people can see.
That would be great if you could, Jessica. Thanks. And that was really helpful. Related to that, perhaps, another program that we're starting to hear more and more of is FDA's TAP program. And what exactly is that, and what does a startup need to know about the TAP program?
So I'm going to pull that one up as well so that you guys can see what that looks like. And
is that a potential way of accelerating approval as well?
It absolutely is. So what Frederick's referring to is the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. And let me pop that into the chat before I get started on that. There's also the Safer Technologies Program. There was also at one point a digital health initiative. So what FDA does, since everything through FDA has to be blessed by Congress because it's a legal entity, it's our federal drug administration. Anything that gets changed in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, needs to be approved by Congress. Some of these programs enable FDA to actually test things out before actually bringing it to Congress. And Congress does bless all of these things anyway. But basically what TAP does is it's a program that CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Devices, has launched to help spur more rapid innovation of products. In order to qualify for TAP, there's again some criteria that you have to meet, but the intention is that it expedites patient access to innovative devices. So it's absolutely another consideration. There's a specific team within FDA that's kind of dedicated to the advisory of this program, and there's lots of different advantages, again, as you develop your regulatory strategy. I do want to clarify, though, with all of these programs, these aren't pathways to market. Your pathway to market is still Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, 510K, de novo, PMA, but these programs can enable you to engage with FDA, the neurological group, the cardiovascular group, depending upon the technology and the program that's offered. So ideally, if you're retaining regulatory counsel or strategy support from a firm like Veranex or others, they would first and foremost determine what's your pathway to market, and then determine, is there a program like this that would help you to then expedite what that speed to market is based upon your application.
Got it. Very helpful. So for our cohort companies, do take a look at Jessica's links in the chat. And a quick reminder, just queue up your questions, and we'll get to those at the top of the hour. Jack, I want to talk briefly about evidence and clinical data, and for regulatory authorities across Asia Pacific, do they generally recognize clinical data from outside of their country? I know until relatively recently, the NMPA or the CFDA, as it was known then, wanted to have data done in China. That then changed. Are regulatory authorities in Asia Pacific generally able to consider foreign data?
Yes. The quick answer is yes. Good news is most of the Asia regulator accept US, Europe data, but they will always ask the question is, still you need to provide justification why that so-called overseas data, clinical data can apply to the population in their country. For that part, I believe lots of startup colleagues should able to justify, because most of the time, medical device don't have an ethical difference. If work in Indonesian should work in Singaporean, most of the time like that. However, some country, for example, China, for some of a high-risk device, they may still require local clinical study. Of course, you still can negotiate with your overseas data. The government never say never, no. But the thing is, they will incline to have clinical data for some of the high-risk device. So China always keep on updating their guidance notes that some device already waived, no need local study. So that one is good news. And if you are not in that list, then that means negotiation, or it means you need to do it. But that's China. Most country, come back to your question, is allow so-called using overseas data.
Okay, very, very helpful, Jack. Thanks. And Jessica, for the US FDA, is there a particular point at which local non-US startups need to consider US trials for FDA submission? And if they're doing clinical trials outside of the US, is there something they can do to ensure that that data can then be used in their US submission?
Yeah, I think, clinical data is something that, we spend a lot of time working with clients around strategy. And I want to just clarify, there are lots of reasons to conduct trials and to conduct clinical investigations. Sometimes it's in support of a regulatory submission or filing. Sometimes it's for marketing. Sometimes it's for reimbursement. Sometimes it's for evidence, early feasibility. So there's lots of different types of clinical data that you'd be gathering. What Jack said, I think, is an important distinction in the US. So whether you're a US startup or a non-US startup, FDA is going to expect that the patient population for which you are conducting a test is reflective of the US patient population's diversity. And so why I highlight this is that, let me also say that actually for 510Ks, 80% of the time, companies are not required to submit human clinical evidence to support your 510K submission. For de novos and PMAs, there's a very high likelihood that you will need to submit human clinical data. In those instances, FDA is going to expect that the patient population is reflective of the US patient population. So depending upon where you choose to conduct your study, you may be able to argue that, yes, you have the right mix of diversity. In many instances, like, for example, if you're conducting your study in Sweden, it's going to be really difficult to say that the Swedish patient population is reflective of the US patient population because of diversity. The reason this has had a more specific lens is, like, I'll give the example of pulse oximeters. We now know that in darker skinned or darker melanin people, pulse oximeters accuracy was grossly inaccurate compared to lighter skinned people. And that wasn't properly captured because of the data points and the subject kind of enrollment in clinical studies. So it is important that I would recommend meet with FDA if you think that there's going to be a need for human clinical evidence. It's not a guarantee that they'll require that you conduct that study in the US, but it's going maybe easier just from a diversity of your subject standpoint. The other thing to think about is if you're planning to sell in the US market, oftentimes clinicians will appreciate global data. We live in a global environment, but some of the practices or the specifics around the practice of medicine in a specialty, they may want to see, specific key opinion leaders on those studies, or they may want to see that those studies have been done in centers of excellence. And so again, this speaks to the greater marketing strategy. It's one thing to get a product through the regulatory process, and we can do that. But if you ultimately then have a product that you can't sell because you're not hitting those commercial claims. So we really try to start with the end in mind in the design of a clinical study so that you can capture as many of those stakeholders and really maximize the value of the investment in the clinical trial. So again, 510K, typically 80% of the time, you're not going to be required to conduct clinical trials, although there may still be advantages with de novos, PMAs, moderate risk, plus high risk devices, you typically will.
Very, very helpful. And just for our cohorts information, we will do a whole separate webinar on clinical trial management because that's obviously is a whole separate topic on its own that requires a lot more in-depth discussion. A few questions from that our cohort have queued up. One was about MDSAP and the Medical Device Single Audit Program. And Jack, maybe I'll turn to you on this first. What does a startup need to know about MDSAP, and is it something that will help accelerate access to APAC markets?
Yep, I think MDSAP is a Medical Device Single Audit Program. That's being recognized in quite a number of Asian countries, including Japan and Korea. And Singapore is also an official observer as well. So it's a expanding program, getting more and more recognition. So if you go for registration approval in Asia, this program definitely help. But from my angle, not like super critical at the moment, because most of the country at the moment don't require audit. For example, you go, again, most of the Southeast Asia country, they just need to look at your ISO certificate. Okay, good. then they will give you approval. They seldomly go outside to do audit. The MTI program will be helpful to save the journey because some country, for example, Korea, they will go to audit your plant. And now with this, they save their trip. And that's the purpose because regulators don't have time to audit all the plant in the whole world like that. So that's why they save their time. So for Korea, it makes sense to do it. But for most of the country in Asia, because they rely on the paper audit only, then maybe your ISO certificate enough.
Got it. That's helpful. And Jessica, another question that we had here from our cohort related to software as a medical device. When and how does that apply? And there's also the term clinical decision support software, and how is that different from software as a medical device?
It's a great question, and thanks for raising that, whoever did in the cohort, because this is confusing even to people that are very familiar in the space. So I'll just work through some definitions and then some of the differences, and hopefully some examples will be helpful. So software as a medical device, it's also called SaMD, refers to software that's intended to be used for medical purposes and that performs these purposes without being part of hardware. So it's truly not contingent upon and working with hardware to function. There's also SIMD, software in a medical device, which many medical devices have software, but software as a medical device can be used on various platforms, including computers, mobile devices, phones, obviously cloud-based environments. So SaMD is really specifically for diagnosing, for treatment, for monitoring, and we have seen a huge uptick. I would say about 30% of the products that we're helping to bring through the market right now are software as a medical device. In some instances, it's easier because you don't have to deal with sterilization and patient contact and any of those electrical, magnetic testing. But you've got cybersecurity and total product life cycle and threat modeling and all these other things that get, introduced. So some kind of examples of traditional SaMD applications, like there's a mobile app that analyzes skin cancer for detection. There's software that processes patient data to predict disease or risk. Programs that help to assist in managing chronic illnesses like diabetes, looking at glucose levels. So those are just kind of examples of SaMD, of true software as a medical device. Here's where it gets a little confusing. Clinical Decision Support Software, or CDSS, is essentially provides healthcare professionals with knowledge and patient-specific information that's filtered or presented to enhance health and healthcare decisions. There are some instances where clinical decision support software is regulated as a software, as a medical device. And there are some instances where it's not, where it's really just a tool to aid clinicians in decision-making. So it's really important, if you have a product that's a tool in decision-making, that you assess, does it qualify? Does it meet FDA's definition of a regulated medical device? Or is it just an aid to a physician that then enables them to make quicker decisions? So I'll give you kind of some examples, and I think this will hopefully be helpful. But SaMDs are subject to regulatory requirements. It's a medical device, and clinical decision support tools, depending upon their functionalities, may not be. So a software that analyzes radiological images, like a breast cancer screening, and then actually helps the clinician to say, hey, here's a spot that is an issue, or here's some things based upon the algorithms and all these other things that we think is concerning. That absolutely is a regulated medical device.
Right. In
contrast, an application that maybe provides drug interaction alerts. So, you've got a physician that's going through a database and going to prescribe something, and that you get an alert that says, alert, this is, contraindicated, or this, based upon the patient medication list, may not be suitable for the patient. And then the physician has to look at that and make a decision. That's an example of something that is a clinical decision support tool. So it's taking what's information in the public domain. It's not diagnosing, managing, treating, mitigating, or treating a disease. It's just helping or enabling that physician to make an informed decision.
Got it.
Both are highly saleable. Both are commercializable products. It's just different of how they're regulated.
Okay, very, very helpful. Thanks, Jessica. I'm conscious of time. We really just have 4 or 5 minutes left, but I did want to just have your input on some of the latest developments in how regulatory authorities treat artificial intelligence. And Jack, maybe let me turn to you first. In APAC, it's typically been Korea, if I'm not mistaken, and Australia that have taken the lead in terms of developing guidelines for AI. What are some of the latest developments there? Some of the anticipated regulatory changes, perhaps in the use of AI in devices, and is there anything that startups can do to prepare for some of those changes?
Thank you, Patrick. And you're right. Japan, Korea, Singapore, etc. They are actively developing guidance document for AI medical device. They have a particular dedicated colleagues department to take care of that. I think the challenge about AI is any guidance document cannot catch up with the innovation. I think our innovator are quicker. So that essentially means the startup need to proactively make use of any channel, like the one we just mentioned, the pre-submission meeting, etc., to discuss their product, their strategy, their idea like that, so that they can develop a more feasible pathway to register the product. I see when I look at all the different regulators when they deal with AI, they have more challenge than the company, because they need to see so many products from different companies to them. Number one is the logic behind, because the people will describe the thinking being inside the software is like a black box. Can you explain it? Sometimes to startup also not that easy to explain the algorithm inside. That's number one. And number two, of course, is the data source. There's also another big challenge. The regulator also, why only take one hospital? Maybe because of the good relationship only. But if I apply to other hospital, may not work because there's some bias there, etc. So they spend a lot of time on this so-called data source. How good is the data as well? And that's why, again, talk to regulator earlier. You don't want to spend so many months on one hospital. You go there, let's say 100 patients, feel very good, and then go there, they say no, too biased. Then I need to start again or do more like that. So there's some tips or some challenge the regulator they're facing as well.
That's helpful, Jack. Thank you for that. And Jessica, the US FDA, any latest developments there on AI and the regulation of AI?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a really exciting development in our field across the globe. I think FDA, like Jack said so eloquently, everybody's struggling to get caught up, but as soon as you release something, it's outdated. So there are a couple of things that I would point to, and I'll add another link to the group chat. But there is an AI and ML based software as a medical device action plan that FDA released in 2021, and it really outlines the FDA's intended approach to further develop regulatory oversight around AI and ML. You know, FDA is all about sharing their current thinking so that, again, innovators can respond to that and provide documentation. The worst word you can say to FDA, well, there's a lot of bad ones, but black box, right? Jack said it perfectly, right? That you need to be able to show your work. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have data integrity, where the data has come from, that it's a diverse data set, that there are controls in place. And the challenge when you have people that are very technology savvy, but maybe less savvy with the quality controls and risk controls that are required to bringing a device to market, there's a bit of a butting of heads there. So FDA has put out their framework around their current thinking. They've also, and this is most recent, developed and released a predetermined change control plan. Because the difference when you have hardware and you're iterating it, you've got to conduct all these tests. Well, with AI, you can find a bug and fix it tomorrow and release it, right? So the proposer around the predetermined change control plan is allowing manufacturers predefined types of modifications that they can make with AI and ML algorithms to establish a plan for how that would be controlled and assessed. The other thing that's really helpful to us now as kind of regulatory professionals is there's a growing list, and FDA has published this, of approved and cleared AI and ML-enabled medical devices. That's what I'm going to pop into the chat. And it's super helpful as you think about what will if you have an AI and ML device, what will I need to demonstrate to FDA? What will I need to prove as far as that verification validation? Well, looking at some of these products, and hopefully that link works, and if it's not a link, I can try to make it right. But that shows FDA, right? You can see this is what has been required of other products. Likely, this is what's going to be required of me.
Super helpful. Thank you for that. And for those of you who somehow can't access the chat now, I think we will make sure that we copy those links into our cohort Slack channel as well. We're out of time, I'm afraid. We could have easily gone on here and talked about these topics for much longer. Let me turn to our speakers and maybe ask for some final tips and advice to our cohort as we close. And maybe Jack, I'll turn to you first as we wrap up. Final thoughts, final tips.
Thank you. My one last statement will be, please explore more options. No matter your classification, no matter your pathway, not just one country, but maybe consider Asia as well. Even be your first country of launch, etc. So identify more options.
Very good, thank you. And Jessica, final thoughts.
Yeah, I would say really get clear on your product description, intended use, indications for use, and claims. I mean, if you have those things really well defined, it will take you a very, very long way with regard to the development of your regulatory strategy. The other thing I would just add is, especially with FDA, and I'll pop all of these links into the chat right now, FDA is communicating. There is so much information that's free, that's in the public domain, that enables you to access FDA's precedents around decision making. And so while you may still need to enlist the support of an expert to guide you in that process, I would encourage you to review the information that FDA has put there. There's specific, CDRH Learn and DICE and some other sites that I can include, because there really is a wealth of information that's available.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. We'll make sure that we get all of the links that Jessica has shared available to our cohort, as well as Jack's white paper, and any other resources that you're open to share with our cohort companies would be greatly appreciated. So thank you both so much for being part of our discussion this morning. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our cohort did as well. Don't go away. We'll go into closed door Q&A in just a moment, but this is where we part ways with our live streaming audience. So thank you to those of you who've tuned in on YouTube and LinkedIn.